The man who delivered mail to Cedar Hollow for 40 years had no fingerprints, and not a single person on his route had ever noticed. His name was Walter Briggs. Everyone in town called him Walt. He was 73 years old, walked with a slight forward lean, as if always pushing into a wind that wasn't there, and carried the kind of face that people forgot the moment he turned a corner. Ordinary, forgettable, safe. He had a leather satchel worn pale at the strap, a postal cap faded from navy to the color of a winter sky, and a habit of pausing at the Hendersons' mailbox to scratch their old hound behind the ears. Children waved at him. Mothers trusted him with packages left on porches. He had delivered birthday cards, draft notices, divorce papers, hospital bills, and love letters to 3 generations of the same families. And in all that time, no one had asked him a single real question about who he was. That was exactly how Walter wanted it. But on a cold Tuesday morning in late October, in a town of 4,000 people tucked into the foothills of western Pennsylvania, Walter Briggs heard a sound that he had spent 4 decades trying to forget, and within 3 hours, 2 federal agents would be standing in the back room of the Cedar Hollow post office, and one of them would do something no one in that building had ever seen an agent do. He would take off his sunglasses, look at the old mailman, and slowly come to attention. But that comes later. The morning started the way all his mornings started. Walter woke at 4:50 without an alarm, 10 minutes before the clock would have bothered. He had not used an alarm in 30 years. His body kept time the way some men keep grudges, precisely and without forgiveness. He lay still for a moment in the dark, listening. He always listened first. The refrigerator hum, the tick of the baseboard heater, the wind testing the loose gutter on the north side of the house. Nothing out of place. Only then did he sit up. He made coffee in a steel percolator, black, no sugar, the same way for so long that sweetness now tasted wrong to him. He drank it standing at the kitchen window, looking out at the gray yard and the tree line beyond, where the mist sat low between the trunks like something waiting. His house was small and clean and almost empty. A recliner, a radio, a single bookshelf with field guides to birds and a worn paperback atlas. No photographs. People who visited, on the rare occasion anyone did, sometimes commented on that. No pictures, Walt? And he would smile and say he'd never been much for clutter, and they would let it go because Walt was easy to let go of. He was designed that way. At 5:30, he laced his boots. He did it the same way every morning, a specific cross-lace pattern that he no longer thought about, his fingers moving through a sequence his hands had learned in another life. When he was done, he flexed them slowly, opening and closing each hand, watching the way the skin pulled tight over the knuckles. The fingertips were smooth. Not smooth like youth, smooth like sanded wood. The whorls and ridges that every human being is supposed to carry had been burned away decades ago, leaving skin that was featureless and slightly shiny under the kitchen light. He had stopped seeing them as strange a long time ago. To him, they were just his hands. To anyone who looked closely, they would have been a question with no easy answer. But no one ever looked closely. That was the whole point of a life like Walter's. He pulled on his gloves before he left the house. He always wore gloves, even in summer, and the town had simply accepted it as one of Walt's quiet eccentricities, like the way he never sat with his back to a door, or the way his eyes moved across a room before he entered it. Small things. Forgettable things, the kind of details that, taken alone, mean nothing, and taken together mean a man has trained himself into a shape the world cannot read. The Cedar Hollow post office opened at 6 o'clock. Walter was there at 5:48. He was always early. Marcy Doyle, the postmaster, was already inside, sorting the overnight bins, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with a laugh you could hear from the parking lot, and a soft spot for the old mailman that everyone in town shared. "Morning, Walt," she called without looking up. "Cold one." "Cold one," he agreed, and hung his cap on the hook that had been his for so long it might as well have had his name on it. He sorted his route by hand, though the machines could have done it faster. He liked the order of it, liked knowing every name, every box, every house. He could have walked his route blindfolded. He knew which porches had loose third steps and which dogs barked but never bit, and which windows had eyes behind them at certain hours. He knew Cedar Hollow the way a man knows the lines on his own face, and the town did not know that this knowledge was not gentle familiarity, but something older and harder, a kind of map-making instinct that had once kept him alive in places that did not appear on any map at all. By 7:15, his satchel was loaded, and he was out the door, the white postal truck idling in the cold. He drove the rural sections first, the long county roads where mailboxes stood at the ends of gravel driveways like sentinels. Then he would come back into town and walk the residential blocks on foot, the way he preferred. Walking let him watch. Driving was just transit. Walking was where the world told you things. It was on the third block of his walking route, on Sycamore Street, that everything Walter Briggs had buried for 40 years came back up through the ground. He noticed the car first. He noticed it the way he noticed everything, automatically, the part of his brain that never fully slept, logging it before his conscious mind caught up. A sedan, dark green, parked at the curb in front of the old Maddox place, which had been empty for 2 months since the family moved to Ohio. The car was wrong, not the make, not the model. Wrong in the way it sat. Too low on its suspension at the rear, the way a vehicle sits when there is significant weight in the trunk that does not belong there. Wrong in that the windows were tinted past the legal line for a residential sedan. Wrong in that there was a faint vibration coming from it that he felt more than heard. A low hum at the edge of perception. The kind of sound that most people's brains filter out as nothing. Walter's brain did not filter it out. Walter's brain had been built, very deliberately and very long ago, to do the opposite. He kept walking. He did not slow down. He did not stop. He delivered the Pruitt's electric bill and a catalogue to the empty Maddox box out of pure habit, his hands moving on their own, while his mind went somewhere cold and clear and very, very fast. He listened to the hum. He let it tell him things. Frequency, steadiness, the particular character of the oscillation. A circuit, drawing power, cycling. Not an engine. The engine was off. Not a phone, too low and too constant. Something electronic, something with a timing element, something that hummed at a frequency he had heard before in rooms where a single wrong movement meant the last movement you would ever make. He was at the corner of Sycamore and 4th before he let himself believe it. He had spent 40 years not believing things like this. He had spent 40 years telling himself that the war was over, that the work was done, that Walter Briggs was a mailman, and only a mailman, and the man he had been before had died in a desert on the other side of the world, exactly the way the official record said he had. He had gotten very good at believing it. Most days he believed it completely. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. And his body, standing on a cold street corner in a small Pennsylvania town, was telling him with absolute certainty that there was a device in the trunk of that car, and that it was live, and that the frequency of its timer meant it had hours left, not days. He walked to the payphone outside Dell's Hardware, one of the last public phones in the county, which the town kept partly out of nostalgia and partly because the cell signal in the valley was unreliable. He did not use his own cell phone. The thought of using his own phone never even formed. The instinct against it was so old and so deep that it operated below the level of decision. He dialed the non-emergency line for the county sheriff because 911 would route the call differently, and he wanted this handled a specific way by people on the ground, fast. Cedar Hollow Sheriff, this is dispatch. There's a vehicle parked on Sycamore Street in front of 412, the old Maddox house, Walter said. His voice had changed. He did not notice it, but it had. The folksy slowness was gone. The words came clipped and ordered and precise. Dark green 4-door sedan, partial plate. I can see 3 characters. The rest is obscured. The vehicle is riding low at the rear, consistent with a heavy load in the trunk. There is an audible electronic cycling coming from the vehicle, low frequency, steady, consistent with a timing circuit. You need to clear the residential block from 3rd to 5th, evacuate the houses, and get your bomb disposal unit, or the state police EOD team rolling now. Do not approach the vehicle. Do not let anyone approach the vehicle. Estimated time on the device is under 4 hours, but I would treat it as under 2 to be safe. There was a silence on the line. Sir, the dispatcher said carefully, can I get your name? My name is Walter Briggs. I deliver mail in this town. I need you to listen to me very carefully, because the next decisions you make are going to determine whether people on this street are alive this afternoon. And here is the thing about Cedar Hollow, the thing that saved lives that day. Everyone knew Walt. The dispatcher, a young man named Kevin Pruitt, was the grandson of the very people whose electric bill was sitting in Walter's satchel that morning. He had known Walt the mailman his entire life, and some animal part of Kevin's brain heard the absolute, unshakable authority in that old man's voice, and understood, without being able to explain why, that this was not a confused senior citizen. This was a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. Hold the line, Walt, Kevin said, and Walter heard him turn away from the phone and start barking orders. What happened next changed everything. The sheriff's deputies arrived in 6 minutes. They did not approach the car. They cleared the block, knocking on doors, pulling the Coopers and the Vance family and old Mrs. Abernathy out into the cold morning in their bathrobes, herding them 3 blocks away to the elementary school parking lot. The state police explosive ordnance disposal team was dispatched from the barracks 40 minutes out. And someone, somewhere in that chain of phone calls, fed a description of the device's behavior and the partial plate into a system. A federal system. A system that had not pinged on anything related to Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania in its entire existence. The plate came back to a vehicle that had been reported stolen in Pittsburgh. The behavioral description of the device, low-frequency steady cycling, a timer, a heavy payload, matched a signature in a federal database that was flagged, restricted, and monitored. And the name attached to the original phone report, the man who had identified an active improvised explosive device by sound alone from the sidewalk through a closed trunk, was Walter Briggs. In a building in Washington that did not have its name on the door, a query ran, Walter Briggs, Cedar Hollow, Pennsylvania. The query returned almost nothing, which was itself the most interesting thing about it. A clean record. A federal employment history with the Postal Service going back 4 decades. And then, buried under a classification flag that should not have existed for a mailman, a single sealed file with a designation that made the analyst sit up very straight in her chair. The file was sealed under a program that had been officially terminated in 1984. The program had a name that was not used in open conversation, and the personnel record attached to Walter Briggs, when the analyst's clearance allowed her to crack the first layer, listed him as deceased, killed in action. The date of death was March of 1983. The location was redacted. The cause was listed as operational casualty, remains not recovered. The analyst stared at the screen for a long time. Then she picked up a secure phone. Back in Cedar Hollow, Walter stood in the elementary school parking lot with the evacuated residents, holding his satchel, looking like exactly what he appeared to be. A tired old mailman caught up in something frightening. Mrs. Abernathy was crying. The Cooper children were asking their mother if they were going to die. Walter said nothing. He watched the corner of Sycamore Street with eyes that did not blink as often as they should, and he tracked the movements of the deputies, and he calculated angles and distances and blast radii without meaning to. The math running itself in the back of his head, like a song he could not stop humming. A young woman approached him. She was maybe 25, with a phone in her hand and a press lanyard around her neck. A stringer for the county paper who had been monitoring the police scanner and had driven straight to the scene. Her name was Dana Okafor, and she would matter to this story more than she could possibly have known in that moment. "Excuse me, sir, were you the one who called it in? I heard on the scanner a mail carrier reported the device. That was you?" Walter looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, the mask slipped. She would think about that look for a long time afterward. Would describe it later as the look of a man who had just realized he had stepped on a tripwire he had spent his whole life avoiding. Then, the easy, forgettable smile came back. "I just thought the car looked funny," he said. "Riding low, I called it in. The deputies did the rest. But the scanner said you described the device. Like, specifically, the frequency, the timer. How would a mailman know? I watch a lot of those investigation shows, Walter said, and turned away. But Dana Okafor was not stupid, and she had heard the original call relayed on the scanner, the precise clinical language of it, the blast radius, the EOD terminology. And she did what young reporters do. She started writing it down, every word. The mail carrier who knew too much. It was 9:40 in the morning. The state EOD team rendered the device safe at 11:15. It was real. It was substantial. The disposal technicians, professionals who had seen a great deal, were quiet for a while after they opened the trunk, because the construction of the thing told them something about whoever had built it, and what it told them was not comforting. This was not a hobbyist's work. This was competent. This was meant to do harm to a great many people, and the only reason it had not was that an old man on his mail route had heard it breathing. And at 12:50 in the afternoon, 2 hours and 10 minutes after the device was made safe, a black government SUV with federal plates pulled into the parking lot of the Cedar Hollow post office. Walter was in the back room. He had finished what he could of his route, the parts that weren't cordoned off, and had come back to the office because there was nowhere else to go, and because some part of him knew, the way he knew the frequency of the device, that they would come here. They always came eventually. He had simply assumed, for 40 years, that when they came, it would be the enemy. It had never once occurred to him that it might be his own people, and that they would not know who he was. 2 men entered. Marcy Doyle started to ask if she could help them, and one of them showed her something in a leather wallet that made her go quiet and step back. They were both fit, both wearing the kind of civilian clothes that try and fail to look casual, both moving with the controlled economy of men who had been trained to move. The older of the two, gray at the temples, scanned the room the way Walter scanned rooms. Their eyes met across the post office for half a second, and each of them recognized something in the other, the way one tradesman recognizes another by the wear on his hands. "We're looking for Walter Briggs," the younger one said. "That's me," Walter said. "We'd like to ask you a few questions about the call you made this morning. Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Marcy showed them to the back room, the sorting room, with its long tables and its bins and its smell of paper and rubber bands and machine oil. She hovered at the door, worried, until Walter gave her a small nod that told her it was all right, and she withdrew, though she did not go far. The 3 men stood among the mail bins. For a moment, no one spoke. "Mr. Briggs," the older agent said, "my name is Reyes. This is Agent Park. We're with a federal agency. I'm going to be straight with you, because I think you'll know if I'm not. The device you identified this morning matched a signature in a system most people don't know exists. And when we ran your name to follow up, we got a result we did not expect." Walter said nothing. His face was calm. His hands inside his gloves were perfectly still. "You want to tell me how a mail carrier in a town of 4,000 people identifies an active IED by its acoustic signature through a closed vehicle trunk from a public sidewalk?" Reyes said, "Because the man on the phone this morning used terminology that civilians don't use. EOD blast radius, timing circuit oscillation. You called the device's remaining time within a margin. Our own technicians confirmed almost to the minute." He paused. "Most people, even most cops, walk past a car like that and feel nothing. You heard it. You knew what it was. That's not television, Mr. Briggs. That's training. The kind of training that takes years, and that very few people in this country have ever received." The silence in the sorting room stretched out. "Take off your gloves," Reyes said quietly. It was not a demand. It was almost gentle. "Please." Walter looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he pulled off his right glove and then his left and laid them on the sorting table. He turned his hands palms up under the fluorescent lights and then turned them over. And the 2 agents looked at the smooth, featureless fingertips, the skin sanded blank by something that had happened a very long time ago, and Agent Park made a small sound, almost involuntary. "That's deliberate," Park said softly. That's not an accident. Somebody removed those. They were removed, Walter agreed. It was the first true thing he had said all day. A long time ago, in a place where having fingerprints was a liability. What's your name? Reyes asked. Your real name. Because the file says Walter Briggs has been dead since March of 1983. And there it was. The thing he had run from for 40 years, sitting on a table in a small-town post office, among the catalogs, and the credit card offers, and the birthday cards. Walter was quiet for a long time. Outside, the wind tested the gutter. A truck passed on the road. Somewhere in the front of the building, Marcy Doyle was pretending not to listen and failing. You won't find it in a file you can open, Walter said finally. Not at your clearance. Maybe not at anyone's anymore. The people who knew my name are mostly dead. The program is a footnote that got shredded in '84. But if you go back to your office and you ask for the records on a unit that doesn't have a name, only a designation, and you ask specifically about a man who was reported killed in March of 1983 and whose remains were never recovered, you'll find a ghost. And the ghost is me. Tell me the designation, Reyes said. Walter told him. The change in the room was immediate and total. Reyes, who had spent 22 years in the service of his country and had heard a great many things, went pale. Park took a step back without seeming to know he had done it. And Reyes, the older agent, the man with gray at his temples and a federal badge in his pocket, looked at the old mailman standing among the mail bins in his faded postal uniform, and slowly, deliberately, took off his sunglasses and came to attention. It was not protocol. There was no regulation that called for it. It was something older than regulation, something that lives in the spine of men who understand what certain words cost. Park looked at his partner, confused, and Reyes said, without taking his eyes off Walter, "Stand up straight, son. You're in the presence of someone who earned more than either of us ever will." What did that designation mean? What had Walter Briggs done 40 years ago that could make a federal agent come to attention in the back of a post office? Stay with this story, because what comes next is the part they tried to bury. And if you believe some people deserve to be remembered, no matter how hard the world tried to erase them, this is your moment to subscribe. The designation Walter had spoken belonged to a program that, on paper, had never existed. It was created in the long shadow of the early 1970s, a small and deniable thing born of a specific and ugly need. There were, in those years, certain devices being deployed against American personnel and Allied civilians in theaters of conflict that did not appear on the evening news. Improvised, brilliant, lethal devices, built by men who had learned their trade in proxy wars and were exporting it. And the conventional answer, the bomb disposal units of the regular military, were trained to a doctrine that the enemy had already learned to defeat. What was needed, someone decided in a windowless room, was a different kind of man. A man who could be inserted into places the United States was not officially present. A man who could find a device before it was meant to be found, render it safe or render it useless, and leave no trace that he had ever been there. A man who, if captured, could be disowned completely, because on paper he did not exist, had never existed, was a clerical error, was nobody. They recruited from the edges, men with no families, or men willing to give up their families, men with a particular and rare combination of traits, ice-cold nerves, a near-supernatural sensory acuity, the patience of a stone, and a willingness to disappear. They were trained for years, in disciplines that had no names, in skills that overlapped with the work of explosive ordnance disposal, but went far beyond it, into the realms of acoustics and electronics, and the human psychology of the men who built bombs. They learned to read a device the way a doctor reads a body. They learned to hear the difference between a circuit that had hours left and one that had minutes. They learned, above all, to be invisible. And to be truly invisible, certain things had to be done. Identifying marks were a liability. A captured operative whose fingerprints could be matched against any record anywhere was a thread that could unravel everything. So the fingerprints came off. It was done surgically in the early years, and crudely in the later ones, and it was one of the prices of admission to a brotherhood that did not officially exist and would never be acknowledged. Walter Briggs, who had been born with a different name in a different town, became one of them in 1971. He was 21 years old. He had grown up the quiet, watchful son of a coal country family, with an ear so sensitive that as a boy he could tell which neighbor was coming up the road by the sound of their truck engine half a mile off, and a steadiness of hand that had made him the best squirrel hunter in 3 counties before he was 12. A recruiter found him in basic training, watched him for 3 weeks, and then sat down across from him in a mess hall and offered him a life that would require him to die. He said yes. He was young, and he believed in things then, and the recruiter had been very good at his job. For 12 years, the man who would become Walter Briggs went to places that were not in the newspapers and did work that would never be written down. He defused devices in market squares and embassy basements and the engine compartments of vehicles in cities whose names he was not permitted to speak. He saved lives by the hundreds, perhaps the thousands, and not one of those lives ever knew his name or his face. He worked alone, mostly. He developed the habits that would later read in a small town as harmless eccentricity, the gloves, the watchfulness, the way he never sat with his back to a door. He learned to hear the breathing of machines, and he learned slowly, at a cost that compounded year over year like a debt, what it does to a man's soul to be no one, to belong to nothing, to have your own death already written and filed in a drawer somewhere, waiting only for the date to be filled in. The date was filled in March of 1983. There had been an operation. Walter would not speak of its details, not to Reyes, not to Park, not to anyone, but the broad shape of it was this: a device, a deadline, a building full of people who did not know they were sitting on top of their own deaths. A hospital, in a city he was not allowed to name, in a country the United States was not officially involved with. 300 beds. A maternity ward on the 2nd floor. Someone had decided that the symbolic value of bringing that building down was worth the lives inside it, and someone else, in the windowless room half a world away, had decided that this was the kind of thing Walter's unit existed to prevent. He had gone in alone, the way he always did, posing as a maintenance contractor with papers that would not survive a serious check. He had found the primary device in the basement, in the boiler room, wired into the building's own electrical system so that the building was, in effect, conspiring in its own destruction. He had spent 4 hours with it, 4 hours on his knees in the dark with a penlight in his teeth, listening to it breathe, learning its logic, talking to it the way you talk to a frightened animal you are trying not to startle. He had defeated it. He had felt the particular silence that comes when a device that was counting down stops counting. And then, because he was good, because he was the best, because he had learned to distrust the silence that comes too easily, he had kept looking. And he had found the second device, the insurance. Smaller, smarter, hidden in a place no ordinary technician would have thought to check, set to trigger not on a timer, but on the absence of the first device's signal, so that the very act of defeating the primary bomb would arm the secondary one. It was a beautiful, evil piece of work, designed by a mind that understood exactly how men like Walter thought, and it was already armed because he had already done the thing that armed it. He had perhaps 90 seconds. He had used 85 of them to defeat it. He had used the last 5 to fail, to save the 2 people who mattered, because he had not been entirely alone, not that time. 2 members of his own unit had been with him on that operation. The only 2 operatives he had ever worked with closely enough to trust, the only 2 human beings on the planet who knew his real name and his real face, and the man underneath the ghost. They had been his handlers, his backup, his anchor to the human world. They were waiting for him at the extraction point, which was close, too close, inside the blast radius of a secondary device that no one had known existed until Walter found it with 5 seconds to spare. He had screamed a warning into his radio. He had defeated the device, and the device, dying, had still managed to do the one thing it was built to do, because there had been a third element, a fragmentation charge that the disarming of the trigger could not stop, and it had taken the two people closest to him in the world, and it had very nearly taken him. When the dust settled, a decision was made. The man had been badly hurt, badly enough that he would never work in the field again. The program was already being wound down, its budget questioned, its very existence a political liability in a changing world. And so the simplest, cleanest, most bureaucratically convenient thing was done. The man was declared dead, killed in action, remains not recovered. His file was sealed, and his name was carved, misspelled, onto a wall of stars in a building that honored the dead it could not name. And the broken man who was left over was given a new name, a small pension routed through a civilian cover, and a single instruction that he had followed for 40 years. Disappear. Be no one. Stay dead. He had chosen Cedar Hollow because it was small and quiet and far from anywhere, and he had taken a job delivering mail because it let him walk and watch and be useful in a way that asked nothing of him and gave nothing away. The first years had been the hardest. A man does not simply switch off 12 years of training and 4 decades of vigilance the way you switch off a light. For the first several years in Cedar Hollow, Walter had slept with a chair wedged under the door handle and a knife taped beneath the frame of his bed, and he had mapped every escape route from every building in town, and he had memorized the make and model of every vehicle that belonged on his route, so that any car that did not belong would announce itself to him like a shout. He had woken from nightmares that were not really nightmares, but memories, the boiler room, the pen light, the 5 seconds, the warning that came too late. He had sat in his recliner in the dark and listened to the silence, and waited for it to be broken by men coming to finish what 1983 had started. They never came. Slowly, year by year, the chair came out from under the door handle. The knife stayed taped to the bed frame, because some habits are load-bearing and cannot be removed without the whole structure coming down, but he stopped checking it every night. He learned the names of the people on his route, and then the names of their children, and then the names of their children's children. He let the town's small, ordinary rhythms wash over him until they began, almost against his will, to feel like his own. He was useful. He was trusted. He was, in the shallow, safe way that towns know their mailmen, loved. And yet, he never once let anyone closer than that, because closeness was a thread, and threads got pulled, and he had learned in the worst possible way what happened to the people who knew his name. He told himself, every morning, that the man who had knelt in that boiler room was dead, and that Walter Briggs was a mailman, and only a mailman. And most mornings, after a very long time, he almost believed it. And for 40 years it had worked. The war he had fought was over. The program was ash. The men who had known him were dying off one by one, of cancer and heart failure and old age, taking the last living memory of him into the ground with them. He had very nearly made it. A few more years and Walter Briggs would have died as Walter Briggs, an old mailman with no family and no past, and the ghost underneath would have gone into the dark, unremembered, exactly as planned. But that morning he had heard a car breathing on Sycamore Street, and 40 years of careful invisibility had collapsed in the time it took him to pick up a payphone, because some things are deeper than training and stronger than fear, and one of them is the thing that makes a man unable to walk past a bomb and let it kill the children on his route. You could have walked away, Reyes said quietly, in the sorting room. You could have called it in anonymously and gone home. You had to know a real report would put you in a system. You had to know it could surface you. Why? Walter looked at him with those pale, steady eyes. The Cooper kids are on that block, he said. I've been delivering their birthday cards since they were born. Mrs. Abernathy can't walk faster than a shuffle. She'd never have cleared the radius on her own. I spent 12 years making sure people I'd never meet got to grow old. He picked his gloves up off the table and turned them over in his ruined hands. I wasn't going to start walking past the ones I knew. Park, the younger agent, cleared his throat. He had been quiet for a while. Sir, he said, the signature on that device, the construction, we flagged it because it matches a builder we've been tracking. Same techniques, same logic, evolved over decades but recognizably the same hand or the same school. We've been 3 steps behind this person for 2 years. We have lost people to their work. He paused. You heard it from a sidewalk. You called the timer to the minute. We have a room full of analysts and technicians who couldn't do what you did this morning, and you've been retired for 40 years. Walter said nothing. We're not here to put you back in a drawer, Reyes said. I want to be clear about that. The agency that ran your program is gone, and the people who gave you your orders are mostly dead, and nobody alive has the authority to order you to do anything. You're a free man. Whatever you decide here, you walk out of this building and back to your life if that's what you want. He paused and chose his next words carefully. But I'm asking, not ordering, asking. We have a device maker who is killing people and getting better at it, and I have just watched a 73-year-old mailman do something my entire unit cannot do. I'm asking if you'd be willing to look at what we have. And here was the moment. Here was the fork in the road that Walter Briggs had spent 40 years making sure he would never reach. What would you have done? Drop it in the comments. And if you've ever known someone who carried a whole hidden life behind an ordinary face, this is the part of the story you'll want to see through to the end. Walter did not answer right away. He walked to the small window of the sorting room and looked out at the gray afternoon, at the parking lot, at the edge of the town that had been his hiding place, and, somewhere along the way, without his permission, his home. He thought about the two people who had died in 1983, the only two who had known his name, and how their deaths had taught him that the price of being known was paid by the people who knew you. He thought about Marcy Doyle, hovering at the door, worried about her old mailman. He thought about Dana Okafor with her phone and her notebook, already writing the story that would, whether he liked it or not, begin to pull the thread. And he thought about the device maker, a man, somewhere, building better and better machines for killing strangers. The exact kind of man Walter had spent 12 years hunting in the dark, before the dark took everything from him and spat him out into a life of catalogs and birthday cards. There's a problem with what you're asking, Walter said, still looking out the window. 40 years ago I was a tool that worked because nobody knew it existed. The whole value of what I did was the silence. The moment you bring me into a room with your analysts and your case files, I stop being a ghost. I become a man with a name and a face and an address. And men with names and faces and addresses can be found. He turned around. I learned what happens to the people standing next to me when I get found. I buried that lesson in 1983. I'm not in a hurry to dig it up. The man who built that device doesn't know you exist, Park said. Nobody knows what you did this morning except the people in this building and a handful of cleared personnel. A reporter knows, Walter said. There's a young woman with a press badge who heard my call on the scanner and is right now writing a story about a mailman who knew too much. By tomorrow morning the thread is already pulled. That's not your fault. It's not hers. It's just the nature of the thing. The silence is already broken. The only question now is what I do with the noise. The three men stood in the sorting room as the afternoon light failed. I'll look at your files, Walter said finally. Once. I'll tell you what I can about the hand that built that device, because I've held the work of men trained the way I was trained, and I might see something your people can't. But understand me clearly. I am not coming back. I am not your operative. I died in 1983 and most of me stayed dead, and what's left is an old man who delivers mail and intends to keep delivering mail until he can't. You get one look at this old man's eyes on your evidence, and then I go home, and you let Walter Briggs stay buried, on paper and everywhere else. Those are my terms. Those are fair terms, Reyes said. That should have been the end of it. A single consultation, a quiet old man lending 40-year-old expertise to a problem and then withdrawing back into his small life. That is what everyone in that room believed was about to happen. But that was not the full story, because three things were already in motion that none of them could see, and each of them would change the shape of what came next. The first was Dana Okafor's story, which would run in the county paper 2 days later under a headline about a heroic local mailman, and which would be picked up by a regional outlet and then a national wire, because in a slow news week, the image of a humble small-town letter carrier saving his neighbors from a car bomb was exactly the kind of story the world wanted to hear. Dinah, to her credit, had no idea what she was setting in motion. She thought she was writing a feel-good piece about a good man. She did not know that certain people, reading that wire story in certain rooms, would look at the strange specificity of the mailman's knowledge and begin to ask the same questions Reyes had asked. The second was the analyst in Washington, the one who had cracked the first layer of Walter's sealed file. She had done her job correctly, had flagged the anomaly and routed it up the chain. But the chain led to places and people who had reasons of their own to be very interested in a ghost from a program that was supposed to have been shredded in 1984. Not all of those reasons were benign. There were men, old now but still powerful, who had been junior officers in that windowless room in the early 70s, and who had built careers and reputations on the assumption that no one who could contradict the official version of certain events was still alive to do so. The reappearance of an operative who was supposed to be dead was, to a few specific people, not a heartwarming story. It was a loose end. And the third thing in motion was the device maker himself, because the man who had built the bomb in the trunk of that green sedan had not built it for no reason, and he had not chosen Cedar Hollow at random, and the failure of his device that morning was, to him, not a defeat but a data point. He had been testing something, and when the news of his failure reached him, along with the curious detail that had begun to circulate, the detail about an old mailman who had identified his work by sound alone, he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt recognized. He felt across 40 years and a continent the presence of a peer. He had been trained too, in a different program, by a different country, in the same dark years. And he had heard the legends, the way men in that world heard legends, about a small American unit of ghosts who could hear a device breathing. He had believed them to be myth. And now, in a county newspaper story written by a young woman who had no idea what she was holding, he found evidence that one of the ghosts was real and old and living in a small town in Pennsylvania and delivering mail. The hunter had become the hunted, and the hunted did not yet know it, but all of that was still days away. For now, on that cold October evening, Walter Briggs put his gloves back on, said goodbye to a frightened Marcy Doyle, and walked home through the dark to his small, clean, empty house. He sat in his recliner. He did not turn on the radio. He sat in the silence he had built his life around, and for the first time in 40 years, the silence did not feel safe. It felt like the held breath before a sound he had spent his whole life learning to hear. The next morning, he did his route. Of course he did. The block on Sycamore was reopened, the green sedan towed away to a federal facility, the residents back in their homes telling and retelling the story of how their mailman had saved them. They greeted him on his route like a hero. Mrs. Abernathy pressed a tin of cookies into his hands and cried and called him an angel. The Cooper children had drawn him a picture, a stick figure in a postal cap standing in front of a car with a big red X over it and the words, "Thank you, Mr. Walt," in crooked crayon letters. Walter took the picture and looked at it for a long time, and something in his chest moved that had not moved in decades, and he had to turn away so the children would not see his face. He had spent 40 years making sure no one knew him, and now, because of one morning, the whole town knew him as exactly the wrong kind of hero, the visible kind, the kind that ends up in newspapers. He had broken his own first rule, and he had broken it for the best reason a man can have, and he understood with cold clarity that the breaking could not be undone. That afternoon, Dana Okafor was waiting for him at the post office. She was nervous. She had her notebook and her phone and the particular determination of a young journalist who has caught the scent of something larger than her assignment. She apologized for ambushing him. She said the story was running tomorrow, that she'd kept it simple, just the heroic mailman angle, that she hadn't put in the strange details about the device because she didn't fully understand them and didn't want to get them wrong. But she said it in a way that made clear she knew the strange details were the real story, and that she was giving him a chance to tell her about them on his own terms. "You're a good reporter," Walter said, "and a kind one, which is rarer. So I'm going to tell you something, and I'm going to ask you to do the hardest thing a reporter ever does, which is to know a true thing and not print it." Dana waited. "There's no story here beyond the one you've written," Walter said. "Old mailman gets lucky, notices a funny-looking car, calls it in, deputies handle it. That's the truth that's safe to tell. The other truth, the one you can smell but can't quite see, that one isn't mine to give you, and if you chase it, you won't just be writing about my life. You'll be writing about people who died so I could stand here, and you'll be putting yourself in front of things you don't understand. I'm asking you, as a favor from an old man to a young woman with a good heart, to write the safe truth and let the dangerous one alone." Dana looked at him for a long moment. She was young, but she was not naive, and she heard in his voice the same thing Kevin the dispatcher had heard the morning before, the unshakable authority of a man who knew exactly what he was talking about. "That bad?" she said quietly. "That bad," Walter said. "And maybe worse now that the wire's going to pick it up. The simple story is going to travel further than you think. There's nothing either of us can do about that. But you don't have to be the one who pulls the thread the rest of the way. Some threads, when you pull them, the whole world you didn't know about comes apart, and people get hurt who never asked to be in the story at all." She closed her notebook. "Okay," she said. "The safe truth. But Mr. Briggs, if it ever stops being safe to keep quiet, if you ever need someone on the outside who knows even a little of what's really going on, you call me. I gave you my card. I mean it." It was a small kindness, and Walter, who had lived 40 years without small kindnesses because he had not allowed himself any, found that it landed harder than he expected. He nodded. He took the card. He put it in his shirt pocket, behind the postal logo, and he would be glad of it sooner than he knew. 3 days later, Reyes came back, alone this time, in an unmarked car, and took Walter to a field office in Pittsburgh, where, in a windowless room that Walter recognized in his bones, he was shown the files on the device maker. He looked at the photographs of the disarmed devices, the recovered fragments, the diagrams the technicians had reconstructed, and the agents watched an old man's face change as he looked, watched the mailman fall away and something else come forward, something focused and cold and very old. He looked for 2 hours in near total silence, occasionally asking for a magnifying loupe or a different photograph or a measurement. And at the end of the 2 hours he sat back and rubbed his ruined fingertips together, a gesture the agents would come to recognize as the thing he did when he was thinking hardest. And he told them 3 things that their entire analytical apparatus had missed. He told them the builder was left-handed from the consistent orientation of certain solder joints. He told them the builder had been trained in a specific school of device construction that Walter named, a doctrine from a particular foreign program of the same era as his own, which meant the builder was almost certainly an old man now, like Walter, a ghost from the same dead world. And he told them that the device in Cedar Hollow had not been meant to go off. "What do you mean it wasn't meant to go off?" Reyes said. "It was live. Our techs confirmed it was live." "It was live," Walter agreed, "but the timer was set long, and the placement was wrong for maximum casualties, and the acoustic signature was loud. A man who builds the way this man builds doesn't make placement errors and doesn't build loud when he wants to build quiet. He wanted it found. He wanted it found by someone specific." Walter looked up at Reyes with those pale eyes. "He wanted it found by me. He'd heard the legend. He wanted to know if the ghost was real, and now he knows." The room was very quiet. "You're saying," Park said slowly, "that this whole thing, the car, the bomb, the whole morning, was a letter," Walter said, "addressed to me, and I answered it. The moment I picked up that payphone and described his work in his own language, I told him everything he wanted to know. That I'm alive, that I'm here, that I still hear." He stood up. "I told you the silence was already broken. I didn't understand yet how broken. He's not coming for the town. He never was. The town was just the envelope. He's coming for me, and he'll keep building letters until I either answer them or until one of them kills enough of my neighbors to flush me out. What comes next is the part of this story that almost didn't survive to be told, because the choice Walter Briggs made in that windowless room is the choice that defines him, and it is not the choice you would expect. If you've come this far, you already know this is a story about a man who could not walk past the people he was meant to protect. So you can already feel where this is going. Stay with it. Walter Briggs had spent 40 years learning how to be no one. And in a windowless room in Pittsburgh, he understood that being no one was no longer an option. Because somewhere out there, an old man like himself, the last products of 2 dead programs that had turned human beings into instruments, was building bombs and addressing them to a ghost. If Walter ran, the bombs would keep coming, and they would land in towns full of Mrs. Abernathy's and Cooper children. If Walter hid, the silence he hid in would be paid for, again, by people who did not know his name. He had buried that lesson once. He was not willing to bury it twice. "I have a counteroffer to your offer," Walter said to Reyes. "You asked me to consult. I'm going to do more than consult, but on my terms, and you're going to follow them exactly, because I am the only person in this building who has ever done this work and lived. You don't put me in a system. You don't give me a badge. You don't write my name down anywhere it can be found. As far as your agency's records are concerned, I stay dead, because the moment I'm alive on paper, the men who buried me in '83 for their own reasons get interested, and I have enough enemies for one old man without adding the ones in my own government." He paused. "You give me access to his work, all of it, every device, every fragment, every scrap, and you let me do the one thing I'm still good for. You let me read his letters and write him back, because I'm the only one who can, and maybe, if I do it right, I can draw him out into the open, where your people can take him, before he addresses one of his letters to a school instead of a street." Reyes looked at him for a long time. "That's not consulting," he said. "That's going operational. At 73, with no support structure, no official status, no protection if it goes wrong." "It went wrong 40 years ago," Walter said. "Everything after that has been borrowed time. I'd rather spend the last of it doing the one thing I was actually good at than hiding from it in a recliner. You want to catch this man. I'm the bait he's already chosen, and the only hunter who can recognize his tracks. Use me, but use me my way, or don't use me at all." And so it began, the strange final chapter of a life that was supposed to have ended in 1983. Over the weeks that followed, in conditions of secrecy that even the agency found extreme, an old mailman became the quiet center of a manhunt that did not officially exist. He kept his route. That was non-negotiable. He would not abandon the town, and besides, his routine was his cover, and breaking it would signal to the watching device maker that something had changed. So every morning Walter Briggs delivered the mail, scratched the Henderson's hound behind the ears, handed Mrs. Abernathy her Social Security check, and waved at the Cooper children. And every afternoon, in safe houses and field offices, and once in the back of a van parked in a Walmart lot, he studied the work of his enemy and slowly, patiently, began to write back. He did it through the work itself. The device maker wanted to know if the ghost was real. Walter let him know, through the way the next devices were handled, that the ghost was not only real, but reading him fluently. When a second device appeared, in a neighboring county, placed and built as another test, Walter directed its handling in a way that left a signature of its own, a way of rendering it safe that only another trained man would recognize, a message in a language only 2 living people on Earth still spoke. It said, "I see you. I know your school. I know your hand. I am still here." It was the most dangerous correspondence imaginable, conducted in live explosives across the hills of western Pennsylvania, 2 old men who had been made into weapons by dead empires, speaking to each other one last time in the only language they had ever truly shared. The second device had appeared 11 days after the first, in the parking lot of a shopping plaza 2 counties over, in a delivery van that did not belong to any delivery company. Walter had been driven to the scene at 3 in the morning, and he had stood in the cordon in the cold and listened the way he had listened on Sycamore Street, and he had felt the builder's hand in the work before he ever saw the device. It was a more complex piece than the first, a deliberate escalation, a sentence in a conversation. It said, "Are you sure it was you? Prove it was not luck." and Walter had directed its disarming personally, talking the EOD technician through it over a secure channel, his voice flat and certain in the man's ear. And at the end he had instructed the technician to leave the disarmed device in a very specific state, 3 wires cut in a particular sequence that served no functional purpose, and that no ordinary technician would ever have chosen. It was a signature. It was a reply. It said, "It was me. I know your school. I know your hand. I cut your insurance the way you taught me to cut it 40 years ago without ever meeting you, because we were taught by the same dead men. I am still here." The third device never detonated and was never meant to. It was found, by Walter's own prediction of where the builder would place it, in an empty railway maintenance shed. And it was not a bomb at all, but a kind of message. A hollow casing containing nothing but a single component, a timing chip of a very specific and very old design, the kind that had not been manufactured anywhere in the world since the early 1980s. Walter held it in his ruined fingers and understood it completely. It was the builder telling him, "I am old. I am from the dead time, like you. There is no one left who remembers the time we come from except you and me." And Walter had understood then that this was not going to end in an explosion. It was going to end in a conversation, if he could survive long enough to have it. It was the most dangerous game he had ever played. More dangerous than the boiler room, because in the boiler room he had only had to defeat a machine, and a machine has no desire to be understood. This time he was trying to read the mind of a man who was reading his right back, 2 mirrors facing each other across 40 years, and the only way to win was to understand the other man better than he understood himself, before the other man's loneliness curdled into something that would take a town down with it. And slowly Walter began to build a picture of the man. Left-handed, old, trained in a program that mirrored his own. Meticulous but lonely, because the loudness of that first device, the wanting to be found, told Walter something about the builder's state of mind. This was not a man building bombs for a cause anymore. The cause was dead, the program was dead, the world they had both served had ended decades ago. This was a man who, like Walter, had been left over when the war ended, a tool with no hand to wield it, an instrument that could no longer stop making the only sound it knew how to make. The device maker was not trying to kill people, not really, not anymore. He was trying to be seen before the end by the only kind of person who could understand what he was. He was, in his own broken and lethal way, doing the only thing left to a man whose entire world had been erased. He was trying not to die unremembered. Walter understood this, because it was the same hunger he had felt when he took the picture from the Cooper children and had to turn away. The 2 men were dying versions of the same wound. And that understanding is what allowed Walter to do, in the end, the thing the agency's analysts and operators could never have done. He did not outthink the device maker, or outfight him, or outshoot him. He outunderstood him. He recognized that a man who wanted to be seen could be drawn into the open not by a trap, but by an answer. And so, with Reyes's reluctant agreement and Overpark's strenuous objection, Walter wrote his final letter, not in explosives this time, but in the oldest medium there is. He let himself be found. How he did it, and what passed between 2 old ghosts when they finally stood face to face in an abandoned rail yard outside the town, after 40 years of being no one, is the part of the story that the agency still will not confirm and Walter still will not fully describe. But this much is known. Walter had picked the place. He had insisted on it. A disused rail yard at the edge of the county, a graveyard of rusting boxcars and weeds growing through gravel, a place with long sight lines and many exits, a place an old operative would feel safe approaching. He had let himself be found there the way you leave a door unlocked for a guest you are not entirely sure you want, through a pattern in the handling of the previous devices that any trained man would read as an invitation and an address. And on a cold, clear night in December, while a federal tactical team lay in the dark among the boxcars with their orders not to move, Walter Briggs walked out into the open, alone, unarmed, an old mailman in a canvas coat, and waited for the last man on earth who spoke his language. The device maker came out of the dark slowly. He was old, as Walter had known he would be, older even than Walter, stooped, moving with the careful economy of a body that has outlived the world it was built for. He too was unarmed, or appeared to be, and he too was alone. They stood perhaps 20 feet apart in the gravel, two relics of two dead programs, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because there was so much that did not need to be said, that could be read in the way each man held himself, in the smooth, ruined hands that Walter held open at his sides, in the particular stillness that marks a man who has spent his life in proximity to things that kill the careless. There were no shots fired by Walter, who had not carried a weapon in 40 years, and did not carry one that night. There were two old men, and a long silence, and then a conversation in a language no one else present could understand, conducted while a federal tactical team held their positions in the dark and were ordered on Walter's absolute insistence not to move unless he gave the word. They spoke for nearly an hour. The tactical team, listening on the wire Walter had agreed to wear, understood almost none of it, because the two men slid between languages and between codes and between references to a world that had been deliberately erased from every record, two survivors comparing the shapes of their identical wounds. The device maker had a name once, in a country that no longer existed under that name. He had been a boy when they took him, younger even than Walter had been, and they had made him into the same thing Walter had been made into. And then his country had dissolved beneath him, and his program had been disbanded, and his handlers had been shot, or had fled, or had simply gone home to be old men. And he had been left over, exactly as Walter had been left over, a weapon with no war, an instrument with no hand. He had spent the decades since drifting, doing his terrible work for whoever would pay, not because he believed in anything, because there was nothing left to believe in, but because it was the only thing he knew how to do, and the only thing that made him feel, for the duration of building a device, that he still existed. And then he had grown old, and the work had stopped being enough, and he had heard, in the way men in that world hear things, the legend of an American ghost who could hear a device breathing, and he had thought, if he is real, then I am not the last. If he is real, then there is one person left on this earth who could look at my work and know what it cost to learn it, who could see me, before I die, as something more than the monster the world would call me, if the world knew I existed at all. So he had built a letter and addressed it to a ghost, and the ghost had answered. And at the end of the conversation, the device maker, who had killed people across 2 continents and 40 years, who had built better and better machines for ending lives, until the only thing he had left to do with his skill was use it to commit a kind of suicide by recognition, set down the device he was carrying, the last letter he had built, the one meant for himself, and let the tactical team take him without a fight. Because Walter had given him the only thing he actually wanted, the thing neither of them had received from the empires that made and discarded them. He had been seen, understood, remembered by someone who knew exactly what he was before the dark took him. "What did you say to him?" Reyes asked, later, in the cold of the rail yard, as the device maker was led away. Walter watched the man go. His ruined fingertips rubbed together slowly. "I told him the truth," Walter said. "I told him that the men who made us are dead, and the wars we fought are over, and the world doesn't even know we existed. I told him that he and I are the last two who remember a thing that the whole rest of the earth has agreed to forget. And I told him that he had a choice about how the remembering ends. He could end it the way they trained us, with a bang, and be a footnote in a casualty report nobody will ever read. Or he could end it the way men end it, by stopping, and let the one person left who understands him carry the memory the rest of the way." He paused. "I told him I'd remember him. Not the bombs. Him. What he could have been, if anyone had ever let him be a man instead of a weapon." Walter turned to Reyes. "That's all any of us ever wanted, to be remembered as more than the thing they used us for. He just needed someone to offer it before he died. So I offered it." Reyes did not have anything to say to that. The story should end there, in the rail yard, with the quiet capture and the strange mercy of one old ghost to another. And in most tellings, it does. But there is a coda, and the coda is the part that matters most, because it is the part about whether a man who spent his whole life being no one can become, at the very end, someone. The Wire story had done its work. Dana Okafor's simple, safe piece about the heroic mailman had traveled, just as Walter predicted, far beyond Cedar Hollow. And among the people who read it were a few of the old men, the ones who had been junior officers in the windowless room in the early 70s, the ones for whom a living ghost was a loose end. They made inquiries. They pulled strings that very old and very powerful men can still pull, and they began, quietly, to ask whether the embarrassment of a 40-year-old secret walking around delivering mail in Pennsylvania might not be best resolved the way such embarrassments had always been resolved. Reyes found out. Reyes, who had come to attention in a post office and meant it, who had spent weeks watching a 73-year-old man do impossible things for no reward and no recognition and no reason except that he could not stop protecting people, made a decision that ended his own career and saved Walter's life. He took the whole thing public, not the operational details which remained sealed, but the existence of the program, the fact that men had been turned into ghosts and then discarded, the fact that at least one of them was still alive and had just, at 73, brought in a device maker that the full resources of a federal agency could not touch. He gave it to Dana Okafor, the young reporter with the good heart, because Walter had told him if it ever stops being safe to keep quiet, there's a young woman who'll know what to do with it. And the dangerous truth, the one Walter had asked her not to print, became the thing that protected him. Because you cannot quietly disappear a man the whole country is reading about. The old men in their clubs and their boardrooms found that their loose end had become a national story about government betrayal of its own most secret servants, and that any harm that came to Walter Briggs now would point directly back at them. The light that Walter had spent 40 years avoiding turned out to be the only thing that could keep him safe. There was a hearing, eventually, a closed session, and then a partial public acknowledgement, the kind the government gives when it has no choice. The program was confirmed to have existed. The men who had served in it, the handful still living, and the many who were not, were formally recognized in language carefully scrubbed of any operational detail, for service to the nation under conditions of extraordinary secrecy and sacrifice. Walter's real name, the one he had been born with, the one that had been carved misspelled onto a wall of stars in 1983, was corrected. He was, on paper, alive again, and acknowledged, and thanked. He did not go to Washington for the ceremony. He sent a letter, delivered by Dana, declining. He had spent enough of his life in windowless rooms. He would take the acknowledgement, he wrote, but he would take it in Cedar Hollow, where the only recognition that had ever meant anything to him was a crayon drawing from two children, whose birthday cards he had been delivering since the day they were born. And so Walter Briggs went back to his root. He was a hero now, the public kind, the kind he had spent his life avoiding, and the town did not fully understand what he had done, but understood that their mailman had turned out to be something extraordinary, and they loved him for it in a way that was no longer shallow. Mrs. Abernathy still cried when she saw him. The Cooper children, who had drawn the picture, were told a careful, age-appropriate version of the truth, and they looked at the old man who handed them their mail with eyes full of a wonder that he found he could finally bear to be looked at with. Marcy Doyle hung the corrected commendation on the wall of the post office, next to the schedule and the wanted posters, and Walter pretended to be embarrassed by it, and was secretly, quietly, after 40 years, glad. He took off his gloves more often now. He had spent 4 decades hiding the ruined fingertips that marked him as something other than ordinary, and now, on warm afternoons, walking his route, he sometimes let his bare hands feel the sun. The town knew the story behind them. The town did not flinch. And Walter discovered, at 73, the thing he had given the device maker in the rail yard and had never once given himself, that to be known, fully known, by people who choose to honor you anyway, is not the liability he had spent his life believing it to be. It is the only thing that makes the carrying worth it. He kept the crayon drawing in the front room of his small house, framed, the first picture he had ever put on a wall, a stick figure in a postal cap, a car with a red X, "Thank you, Mr. Walt." Some nights he sat in his recliner and looked at it, and listened to the silence of the house, and the silence was not the held breath of a man waiting to be found anymore. It was just quiet. The quiet of a man who had finally, after a whole life of it, stopped being no one. The old rotary skills, the trained reflexes, the ear that could hear a machine breathing, they never fully left him, and he knew they never would. Some mornings he still woke at 4:50 and lay in the dark and listened first, the way he had for 50 years, cataloguing the sounds of his small, safe world. But now, when he found that everything was in its place, the refrigerator hum, the baseboard heater, the wind in the gutter, he did not feel the old vigilance. He felt something closer to peace. He had spent his life as an instrument for finding the one wrong sound in a world full of right ones. And he had finally landed in a place where, almost every morning, all the sounds were right. He delivered mail in Cedar Hollow for 2 more years, until his knees finally refused the walking routes and Marcy made him take the truck, and then for 1 more year after that until he retired for real at 76, with a party in the post office that the whole town came to. Dana Okafor came, all the way from the city paper where her story about the mailman had made her career. Reyes came, retired himself now in a good suit, and the 2 old men shook hands with the particular respect of people who have stood together in the dark. And the Cooper children, teenagers now, gave him a new drawing, more skilled than the first, but in the same spirit, of an old man in a postal cap surrounded by the whole town, and underneath it, in careful letters this time, the words, "Our Mr. Walt." He hung it next to the first one. Walter Briggs had been made, by a country that needed a weapon, into a man with no name, no face, no fingerprints, no past, and no future. A ghost designed to do impossible things in the dark and then disappear without a trace. He had spent 40 years successfully being exactly that. And in the end, in a small town in the Pennsylvania hills, by refusing to walk past the people he could save, he had undone the entire design. He had become someone. He had been seen and known and remembered, not for the weapon they had made him into, but for the man he had insisted, against every instruction and every instinct, on becoming. He died at 81, in his sleep, in the small house that was no longer empty, because it now held 3 crayon drawings and a wall of cards from a town that loved him. They buried him under his real name. The whole town came, and on his stone, beneath the corrected name and the dates, at his own quiet request made years before to Dana, who had become something like a daughter to him, there were no medals listed, no program named, no secret acknowledged. There were only 5 words, the truest summary of the longest and strangest journey a human heart can make, from being a weapon to being a man. He could not walk past. Have you ever known someone whose ordinary face hid an extraordinary life? Someone the world overlooked who turned out to be more than anyone imagined? Share their story in the comments, because everyone deserves to be remembered. And if you believe that no one should have to die unknown, that every hidden sacrifice deserves to finally be seen, then subscribe. There are more of these stories waiting. More ghosts who deserve at last to be brought into the light.